My best friend's dad was called to the home of a family that used to force their retarded son to rape their daughter when she was bad. He found her naked in a closet with her hands tied. She spent the first 7 years of her life in a closet naked. She had never worn clothes before. She was put in foster care and my aunt and uncle ended up adopting her. So she became my cousin of sorts. She was always very scared but sweet. I remember the first time we were introduced she asked me, "Do you love me?" And I looked at my mom and she gave me this look like, "You better say yes or I will whip your butt," so I did. We were both about 7 or 8 at the time. She never matured past the mind of a child though. She wasn't born with any mental issues but the neglect and abuse messed her up. The company I work for doesn't usually clean up crime scenes, but it's something my boss has been trying to get into for a while. We have gone and done a couple of bids. Usually when we show up the crime scene is over a week old, sometimes 2. This one in particular, a man murdered his girlfriend and confessed the next day, so it was about 3 or 4 days old. This man stabbed his girlfriend 56 times throughout the home while she was trying to get away. He then scalped her in the bathroom. There was blood and hair everywhere. That's not even the most messed up part. After she was dead, he cut off her boob and cooked it in a frying pan. Drugs were involved. My father is a cop and about 16 years ago he got a well-being call on Christmas. The neighbors hadn't heard from the family, a mother and her daughter, for a few days and they wanted someone to see what was up. My dad wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary and was shocked when he walked inside. The room was black and cold. There was a little girl sitting there staring at a wall with only blankness in her eyes. Beside her laid a naked woman covered in gashes and in a pool of her own blood. Turns out 3 days prior the mother's boyfriend was angry, I forget the reason, and he raped and killed the mother. The little girl who was around 5 years old was blind so she couldn't do anything but sit there. She hadn't eaten for 3 days and could only sit there, cry, and sleep. When I was a med student I spent a month observing at the NYC coroner's office. One day I got to go with the CSIs to a crime scene. It was at a woman's apartment in Midtown. Her boyfriend had shot her in the head before killing himself. They were both Russian, in their 30s. The messed up part, he had waited until they were in bed having sex to commit the murder and suicide. When we got there, they were still naked in bed, him on top of her, the gun still in his hand. They were also bloated and smelly, and covered with flies since it had been 4 days since they had died. Apparently one of the neighbors had heard the gunshot, knocked on their door, and walked in after finding it unlocked. When he saw the bodies he thought they were still having sex and walked right back out. So nobody was called about the crime until 4 days later when the smell made the neighbors call the police. The first suicide scene I walked into was memorable. A college student had duct taped a 12-gauge shotgun to his face. The ceiling was still dripping. The boy had duct taped the muzzle of the shotgun in position over one of his eyes. Before taping the scary end to his face, he had taped the grip to his hand with his finger on the trigger so he couldn't let go. He sat down in the bathroom and once all the tape was applied, he leaned back and slammed his body forward, striking the stock on the floor, which forced his finger to press the trigger. Sadly this was all pre-planned. We found the note in his bedroom. An unexpected, probably, effect of the tape around his head was that it did a very good job of keeping his head intact. Other than the fist-sized exit wound in the back of his head, the skull was held together. Also, if you're having thoughts of suicide, please talk to someone. You are not alone, and people do care about you. I have seen too many families ruined by the suicide of a loved one. You are valued, you are loved, and there is always a way out. My friend is a former Chicago police officer. He told me of this one crime scene he had to go to where the guy was murdered on his kitchen floor and left for 2 weeks before anybody called about it. He was already a larger guy and he had bloated to be at least twice the size. When him and his partner tried to flip him over, the skin that had been touching the tiles were stuck and caused it to completely tear apart. His insides just came gushing out of him and they both ran out because the smell was too intense. I know this is a little different, but still pretty messed up. My best friend and mother is a property manager and she found really screwed up stuff in one of her homes. A 30 to 40-year-old woman and her Down syndrome son rented out one of the houses for 2 or 3 years and then suddenly disappeared without any notice. She was a lawyer by profession and seemed normal, so my friend's mother trusted not to visit the home for the time period. The woman always said she did her own repairs and such, so there was no reason for concern. However, after lack of payments, my friend's mother went to investigate and found a lot of scary stuff. For example, one of the rooms was completely clear of furniture. However, There were small chains screwed into the wall where she kept her son. The walls had severe markings where the son apparently scraped with his fingernails and banged on the walls. He never went to school. According to the neighbors, they'd hear her leave the house while he was screaming but just assumed that he was acting out. I used to work at a family-owned funeral home. I was about 19 years old at the time. We did home pickups on the bodies a lot of times. There was this one guy who had been dead in his apartment for I don't know how long. But when we walked in, the room was filled with flies. Picture the movie The Mummy where a wall of flies shoots out of his mouth. It was sort of thin at first, but as you got closer there was a thick wall where the density and the flies skyrocketed. We were wearing full body suits, so no worries. It was just like something out of a movie. The body was what you would expect. Also had a guy who died in the seat of his car in his driveway. He died holding on to the wheel and rigor mortis set in, so he wasn't letting go. To get him off, I had to bend each finger back. It would crackle like the bones were breaking as I did it. Had to do it slowly to keep from doing too much damage. While doing it I had the dead guy's face right next to mine since he was slouching over. I almost forgot, how could I? When bodies are autopsied, the people who perform the autopsy will send the body to the funeral home without putting them back together. This means the chest and stomach is cut open, rib cage comes in a separate box, organs come in plastic bags, scalp and face cut off but flapped back over the skull. We got in the autopsied body one night and it was really late, so we leave it in the building and we'll fix him up the next day. We come in the next day and there must have been a crack in a wall somewhere or something, but ants found their way in. The body was laying there, chest wide open, mouth and eyes open, covered in ants. There wasn't a single place on the body that wasn't covered in ants. They were crawling in and out of his ribcage, in and out of his nose, mouth, and eyes. We just took a spray bottle of ant killer and sprayed the body down and then washed it off when they all died and fixed it up like normal. My dad's a cop. When I was about 10 I was at his office and he was going through his desk showing me and my mom pictures he found in his desk. Most of them were from one of the Woodstock music festivals he worked and people that he met over the years. Then he opened a manila envelope, and I found myself staring at a photo of a pretty dark-haired woman's head and neck close up. Except her throat was sliced. For some ungodly reason my dad continues going through these pictures. Turns out that the manila envelope contained the crime scene photos of a double homicide. Guy's wife sleeps with her boss, guy kills her boss, with a gun at a different location, and then finds his wife. The first photo he showed me was from the actual scene. The woman's eyes and mouth were wide open and her face was covered in blood. You couldn't see too much around her neck due to the blood, but her head was tilted back an unnatural amount. More photos showed blood splattered all around the house, indicating a very obvious struggle. Other photos showed slice marks on the outside of her forearms, which are very common in knife attacks because the victim usually puts their arms up to protect themselves. One main detail I remember is one of her vessels had fallen out of her arm and it looked like a long hollow spaghetti noodle. The blood on it looked like spaghetti sauce too. The next set of photos was from the coroners and all the blood was cleaned off of her. Now that I think about it, the first boobs I've ever seen may very well have been this dead chick's. Weird. Anyway, I digress. She's all cleaned off and you can see clear down her neck. Real freaky shit seeing all the big vessels, trachea, esophagus. The whole 9 yards. She also had multiple stab wounds in her torso, back and legs, but they didn't look that disgusting, just little slits. Her arms were gnarly though, as I said before they still looked like spaghetti noodles, minus the sauce. Also you could see some muscle in her bone in one. I think that was back when my dad was a homicide detective. He's been a cop for over 30 years and has been a patrol trooper, on the Scuba Rescue, Mobile Response Team, SWAT, Homicide, and Undercover Narcotics. Among other things. Not a cleaner, but my jobs takes my upstairs to the medical examiner's office every now and then. The two worst bodies I have seen are a guy who was shot and then had his trailer set on fire to try and hide the evidence. The smell of charred human flesh is nothing you'll ever forget, or want to smell again. Only his extremities got burned, and his central torso was still mostly unburned so the projectiles could be recovered with minimal damage. A woman who was bludgeoned to death by her ex-boyfriend, who then chopped her body up into 6 pieces and scattered the parts around the county. When I walked in, one medical examiner was holding her head up by the hair while another was drawing eye fluid. They had the whole body laying out in proper orientation on the examination table. The thing about this one didn't hit me until later, I don't remember how long, when I was watching a horror movie. All of the fake dismembering of body parts looked pretty dead on what I saw in the medical examiner's office that day, so Hollywood actually makes some believable gore sometimes. My mom is a hairstylist and is sometimes asked to do the hair for corpses before the funeral. She said the worst one she had to do was a little 7-year-old girl. The girl had been walking along train tracks. When she tripped, she got hit, basically just removing the back of her head. She looked fine besides the giant gaping hole in the back of her head. They had cleaned it all up and packed the hole a little, so it wasn't so bad looking. Medic here saw aftermath of a guy who walked into his front yard and shot himself in the head with a pistol. Would have been dead except that he had a pacemaker. Blood was squirting from the exit or entrance wound, not sure which, and there was white matter all over the head of my stretcher. I learned why it was nicknamed the brain catcher that day. My partner tells a story about a drunk who wandered into the street and fell down. Car ran over the guy's head, crushing. Cranium was empty. He followed the trail about 20 feet and found an intact brain. Must have popped out somehow and soared the distance. My cousin bought this old house years ago, for cheap. The story goes the owner, an older large hermit-type fellow, died in front of the oven with it on full blast. A few weeks later, I believe, the neighbors couldn't stand the stink coming from inside the house. The guy literally melted through the floor and into the floor joists. Cousin managed to rid the house of the smell only by removing every piece of wood the guy's remains touched. Real estate agents were selling the house as property only. Not a CSI, but here goes. My mom inherited a very upscale home in Florida from her dad, and since we lived in CA, she hired a property manager in Palm Beach to find some decent renters. The rent was pretty high and prospective tenants had to go through a background check and put down a large security deposit in the hopes we would find some reliable people. After a few months, they rented the place out to a couple of doctors and their wives who had just relocated to Florida from Ohio. Everything went well for about a year. The people paid their rent on time, no complaints from the neighbors, etc. They gave notice that they were moving out, and when the property managers came in to inspect the place, oh dear God, the place had been completely destroyed. Huge holes in the walls, countertops that looked like they had been set on fire, carpet ripped up, light fixtures removed, and in the master closet, piles and piles of blood-saturated sheets. We called the cops, who suggested that the doctors were running some kind of makeshift surgery clinic out of my mom's house. The doctors disappeared, never to be found, and my mom decided to cut her losses and sold the house. I saw a case of arson once where the house of a man who was in a wheelchair was set on fire. The image of the man, charred with the metal in his chair having essentially fused itself to his body with a screaming expression on his face, will haunt me for the rest of my life. So will the smell. Secondly, I was at a crime scene where a man had his 6-year-old son stab another guy in the neck for a case of beer. Told his son to stick him like a pig. I'll always remember later that night at the police station later on, while the father was being interviewed, the child was sitting in the hallway, covered in the blood of a man that he had just murdered, playing with a teddy bear. Thirdly, I'll never forget the time I found the raped and murdered body of a 16-year-old girl who had been beaten to death with the bottom end of a beer bottle until her skull caved in, her nipples bitten off, and left in a field wearing nothing but an unzipped windbreaker. Killed by her boyfriend's brother because she wouldn't have sex with him. Eventually, I gave up on humanity, quit that line of work. Not my story, but told to me by an old high school coach that used to work for the police. He was called to a house for a wellness check on a lady that was described as 35 years old, white and around 120 pounds. They knocked on the door to no answer and eventually went in. They found a dead woman laying on a bed upstairs, only it wasn't the lady they were there to find. This woman was black and looked as if she weighed 300+ pounds. They called for the team that removes dead bodies from places. While they were waiting, they searched some more and found a purse next to the bed, and it was the license of the white woman they had been called on to check in on. It turns out, the 300-pound woman on the bed was the white woman. She had been dead for a few weeks and had decomposed into a blob of decaying flesh. The worst part is, that as the team that removes bodies prepared to move the body onto the floor and into a body bag, he was told to leave the room if he didn't want to get sick. Not heeding the good advice, he stood by as they proceeded to move the body. She exploded. Like a big blister ready to pop, bodily fluids everywhere. He said he couldn't get the smell out of his mustache for days and eventually just shaved it. Years later I heard he had taken his own life, and I can't help but think this situation and others like it contributed to his decision to do it. One of my old co-workers told me about a scene he had to clean up. He arrived before the crime scene investigators had finished doing all their work. There was a chair in an empty room with one fireplace. Tied the chair's legs were the lower legs of the house owner's wife. No other body parts were on the chair. And resting on the fireplace mantel was the wife's head. Blood everywhere from the dismemberment. The torso and arms were laying around the room. He quit after this particular job not because it scared him or anything, but because the company he worked for was cheap and only paid him $100 for 3 hours of cleaning blood and body parts from the room. I grew up with two brothers that were about 18 months apart in age, but because of how the birthdays fell we're only 1 grade apart. The younger brother was in my grade and the older brother a year above, but we all ran in the same group of friends. Their dad was a deacon in the church, coached our little baseball and football teams, was the PA announcer for years at all of our high school football and baseball games. He was well known by everybody. Anyway, one of our other friends' dad was a cop. During college the father of my buddies called the cop dad and asked him to come over without really saying anything else. The cop dad shows up to find the garage taped off with plastic sheets, like a scene from Dexter, and the father dead in the garage. He had sent his wife out for errands, prepped everything so the cleanup would be as easy as possible, called the cop dad, then shot himself in the head. All because of an affair. One of the worst jobs I ever did was a suicide. The scene was located in a 10 feet deep concrete pit in the ground covered up with boards. The man used a shotgun and had been in the pit for almost 3 weeks liquefying. His wife had asked us to perform the job as rapidly as possible, not wanting her 3 small children to see us around their home. I showed up on a Friday evening and didn't finish the job until 3 p.m. the next day. It was a soupy mix of flesh/fluids, dirt, leaves, and sticks that we scooped up into our bins for removal. The walls were covered in brain matter and skull fragments. The smell is something you will never forget. My dad is a cop and 20 years ago he was responding to a welfare check on some guy that lived up by himself in the mountains. This guy was completely isolated and kept to himself and no one had seen him in months, so they wanted to see what was up. When he pulled up there he could already smell it. He told me that it smelled worse than your normal death smell. Apparently it was the worst thing he's ever smelled in his life. When they went inside they found him dead on his waterbed from an apparent suicide. The way this guy killed himself was pretty interesting. He made himself a human-sized Ziploc bag and duct taped himself into it and then laid down on his waterbed and turned it on. He then gases himself with some aerosol spray which knocked him out and then he suffocated and died. He was then cooking on his waterbed for over 3 months, which essentially turned him into decomposing human soup. Worst part was that they had to take this soup man and make sure it was actually him. My father's friend, an uncle to me, really, worked sanitation in NYC for years. Someone had acquired an elephant and kept it as a pet in their apartment complex in the middle of the city. In the basement. The thing died when it was a teen and there was no way to get it out of the basement without major construction. And the owner didn't want to get in trouble, so he didn't tell anyone about it. The tenants called it in when their heaters all blew decomposing elephant smell into their apartments. My uncle and his fellow sanitation workers had to remove the thing with chainsaws. Also, he went into an apartment, which had been severely neglected. It didn't smell particularly bad, but he got woozy and felt nauseous. He had to leave. As soon as he left, he was fine. He went back in and the room was spinning. He put a hand out on a wall to steady himself and his hand went through the paint and a flood of roaches spewed out everywhere. The place was so infested that they were under the paint, making it ripple and move, giving him a bit of vertigo.